Okay, so Gamunder is the United States, so we have technology transfer through immigration. The last example of technology transfer, I call, technology transfer by paneling around with virtuosos. And the virtuoso here is Ole Bull. Like at 9, he played his first solo. At 30, he had a thriving career. He was sort of a manly man. He was self-taught. He was a self-promoter. Man, he really needed social media. If social media was around, he would thrive on it. He's the type of person that climbed mountains in Norway and played the violin. He then topped that by climbing a pyramid in Egypt. He faced Norway and he played the violin. He was buddies with all these great German composers. Robert Schumann calls him the greatest of all. But what was really cool about Ole Bull was he really liked America. Like, he wanted to come to America. And he ended up, dividing his life, where he would spend winter in America, he would spend summer in Europe, and he came to America all the time. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow invites him to play in Boston, and he comes, and 2,000 people show up. Later on, he goes to Memphis, where 10,000 people show up. This is kind of unheard of at the time. He's in the United States, and when he comes to the United States, for 6 months, he gives 75 concerts. This is not like a player today, where he's giving concerts all the time. They're probably much smaller, more intimate. He's getting to know people. While he's in Boston, though, Ole Bull had a lot of theories on how to make the violin. He was always tinkering with the violin. And when he was in Boston, he needed a luthier to kind of execute some of his theories. So he first went to Ira White, and then he went to another person named Orrin Weeman, but he wasn't really willing to pay them. And they said, no, thank you. They didn't really have a lot of respect for Ole Bull's theories on how to make a violin, make a better violin. But enter Leonard O. Grover. Leonard O. Grover was born in Maine in 1825, but in the 1870s and 1880s, he was the repairer in Boston. Not necessarily for skill, but because he had this gigantic, attractive, personality. First of all, he was really a big person. He was 6'3", he was strong and stout. His side job when he wasn't repairing violins was a piano mover, because he was that big. And then he would sing. He taught singing. He claimed to be the only person in New England that could play the air of a hymn and sing bass to it. One time, someone gave him a new violin from Germany to assess, and he kind of looked at it, and he wanted to test its stiffness, and he was sort of pressing it, and his thumb went through the top of the violin. So his assessment to the very dismayed person was, thin, ain't it? Anyway, he was flattered that Ole Bull came to him and basically asked him to do all this work. And so he was also a smart business person. He worked for nothing. But in exchange, he traded advertising. He basically created a bargain where he got to advertise on his violins that he made violins according to Ole Bull's theory. As a result, he sold more violins. And what we have here is one of those violins made by Leonard O. Grover, 6'3", gregarious, giant person who's paneling around with Ole Bull, experimenting with theories. So let's hear how it sounds.
Produce the repertoire. So this sort of Ole Bull mania is so fascinating, and it's something I ended up reading about a lot in the archives at the American Antiquarian Society. And Americans loved Ole Bull, but specifically New Englanders really loved Ole Bull. There's something about his Norwegianness and this kind of combination of qualities that sort of made him distinctive to Americans that was very appealing to New Englanders. We've got a really fun little musical excerpt here. This is called the Newbird Waltz, and it's by Francis Johnson, who was the first African-American composer to have his music published as sheet music. Oliver Dixon is absolutely a first publisher of his music. And I came across this piece in my own research looking into this family of performers called the Luca family. Now, if you've ever heard of the Hutchinson family singers, they were kind of one of the first performing quartets, performing four-part music, a kind of a variety show. The Luca family sort of modeled themselves on the Hutchinson family singers, singing four-part harmony, but also doubling on instruments, violin, cello, piano, things like that. So I was very interested to look at some concert programs of theirs and see this piece by Francis Johnson that I know in a band version being played by a piano trio, which is piano, violin, and cello. So we'll hear an excerpt on the violin from Maria.
Who found it at a thrift store in central Massachusetts. So, so American violins, not always bought at Sotheby's. Okay, three, all of a sudden, because of being able to examine and study violins, because of immigration, and because of exposure to great violinists and their instruments, Boston instrument making takes off. It starts to become very, very good. What we have here is really fun. This is a Jerome Bonaparte Squire, J.B. Squire as he's known. He, at the age of 16, in around 1850, packs up, leaves the family farm in Ohio, ends up in Michigan, becomes a shoemaker. And then, because Boston is such like a shoemaking capital of the world, ends up, he quote unquote took up with a woman of the stage, ended up in Boston, and ends up in New England, ends up in Maine, and he learns how to make violins from from Henry Harris up in Maine, and he apparently does such a good job making violins that he basically quits, and he goes into Boston. He opens up a shop, and he becomes a violin maker. In fact, his daughter then becomes a conservatory student and played a violin in the white. So essentially it wasn't finished, much like you see that violin all the way at the edge over there. But the teacher, Leonardo Campaneri, who was a BSO soloist and head of the violin department at NEC, was so ecstatic over this instrument that his daughter was playing, that he commissions a whole bunch of instruments from J.B. Squire, and he calls J.B. Squire the American Stradivarius. What's also interesting about, and this is awesome, if you notice the musical instrument room at the MFA, outside there's a portrait of a violin maker, and that violin maker is J.B. Squire, and so that's a picture of him. He's really known for varnish. He spends like all his later lives, trying to perfect varnish. And as you can see, he's working with a red violin, and the violin we have, you know, it's very similar in terms of varnish. What's also interesting about J.B. Squire is that his son, he trained his son to be a violin maker. And his son also made really great violins. But the son also started making strings and wound strings. And his strings were so good that first Chrysler started to use them and Jack Benny. But everyone, you know, using his strings. Fender Guitar noticed this. Fender Guitar then buys his company. Switches the name of the string company, Squire Strings, to Fender, but then says, hey, we kind of like the brand name. So they create a new brand of guitar, more entry-level guitar, called Squire. And so if you go even today to the next slide. No, not this slide. No, not this slide. Was there a slide before that? No. Anyway, okay, that's all right. But if you go into eBay today, there's a whole brand. There are a lot of Squire guitars sold, and Squire, all those Squire guitars really came from the son. Sorry, from the by the son of J.B. Squire. So he created quite a musical dynasty here. Let's see how what a J.B. Squire sounds like.
When I was researching Squire, I was very curious about the fact that Squire opened his violin shop in Boston the same year that the BSO was founded, 1881. So that was either a very strategic move or a lucky coincidence, because Squire's violins ended up in the hands of BSO players in the organization's earliest years. So when thinking about, you know, what music shall we have on this violin for our program today, I thought, well, why don't we just look at the BSO archives? I had the chance to do all this fun archival research in the library, but you from your own home can actually go on the BSO website and search the repertoire that they played on any season in their entire existence. So it's pretty fun. So I got curious, like, you know, what was the BSO playing in the year that this violin was made, which was 1885. And one of the fun pieces that I found is one of my favorites, Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz.
Violin that we are going to play, or at least complete violin that we're going to look at, is by Calvin Baker in 1885. Calvin Baker grew up, born in 1826 in Gardner, Massachusetts. And of course, Gardner is kind of the furniture capital of Massachusetts. So again, you know, lots of, you know, obviously relevant skills all around him. He ends up, though, becoming a boot maker, but he was clearly a good craftsperson, and then he learned violin making when he apprenticed with Asa Warren White, which was Ira White's brother. He then becomes very good. He works at Thompson Odell, which is a big music shop in Boston at the time, and he becomes in charge of their repair department. He does really clean and precise work. Now, what's neat about this violin, though, it's got a bit of Boston history built right in it, and that's because makers at the time, they would always be scouring for really good wood. I mean, it was very important that they found good seasoned wood. And you know, if you cut down a tree, you might have to wait years before that wood becomes seasoned. So what they always did was to look for places where they can get wood. And Calvin Baker found it in the old Marlborough Hotel on Washington Street. So this violin, the top was built from the remnants of the old Marlborough Hotel on Washington Street. Washington Street was the major street in Boston at the time. It was the street that George Washington blocked off to barricade the British, and then the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga came, and the British said, we can't be here, and they then abandoned Boston. So this violin is made from Boston history. Let's hear how it sounds. What we have, today is a story of innovation, right? Folks, we had a problem in church singing. New England ingenuity came to the rescue, created amazing sounded instruments from scratch. Also the need for music for entertainment, and folk instruments and more. Craftspeople came and built amazing instruments. But then as the United States become wealthier and wealthier, tech transfer started to happen. This happened from parent to child, teaching how to do things. It happened from master to apprentice, but it also happened from old world to new world. At the end of the day, I think it's a really positive story, because what's really great is that the United States goes up the learning curve really, really fast. I mean, we learn from the old masters, and we're not afraid to take their ideas, we're not afraid to learn from the best, and then get up to a certain level and innovate from that part on. So I think part of American culture that is able to see something that's built in a different place, but recognize that, hey, this is pretty good. I think that's really beneficial. And rather than being scared of technology or scared of foreign ideas or scared of different ideas, it's amazing to be able to embrace those ideas, take the best from them, and continue onward. So the story on technology, I think, is really positive. The story on art, though, to me is a little bit mixed. There's a part of me that's really sad that the old style of Pickering and of Krihor has been sort of lost. Form follows function a bit. And because these European violins sounded so good, not only did we take their technology, but we started to style the instruments all after European instruments. And in fact, today, in violin making today, it's amazing, but there's this very strong force to make every new violin look like a Cremonese instrument in 1700. It is unbelievably strong and powerful. And the antiquing that Viol started, that continues. And part of me is a little sad that the New England look and the New England style has sort of disappeared. Well, of course, what happens if we started to change that a little bit? With the help of Kevin Kelly, we decided to do a little experiment and see what happens when you take, modern violin theory. And by the way, makers today make incredible violins. We understand a lot about violin making. Today's violin makers produce unbelievably awesome sounding and beautiful instruments. What happens if we took that technology and married it with a bit of New England style? Something that no one has ever done. No one has ever taken the New England style from 150, 200 years ago and built a modern violin with it. So, with the help of Kevin, here's another thing. Kevin is the perfect person to build the New England violin. One, he's an unbelievably accomplished maker. His violins, he submitted a quartet to the Violin Society of America, and his quartet, won top honors. He is a very accomplished violin maker. But most important, but also, he's from Boston. He's a Boston maker. In fact, grew up in Western Massachusetts. Perfect for this project. And even more perfect for this project, though, is Kevin has a science of understanding what a violin looks like. I cannot describe the science. He calls the method, though, involves geometry. It involves looking at the proportions of a violin using geometry. This is known as I think the 4 circles method. Of course, I don't really understand that. I see like 20 circles when I look at what's really nice in that what we did was Kevin took a look at these early American instruments, applied his methodology of understanding how a violin, why it looks the way it does. To come up with the new American violin. So it was more than just a gut feel of looking at a style and copying it. There was that too. There's definitely the art part. But what I really love about Kevin is he brings a bit of science into this as well. And so Kevin, do you want to explain what you did a little bit with this project? And also perhaps
to become this violin project that we're working on now. It's been through a couple different iterations, but one of the things, like if you look at this is a F-hole from a Prescott church bass, and it's very different from a Cremonese sound hole, but it's very cool looking. It's got a very interesting style, and they're consistent. Like you can look at a Prescott, and you see Prescott F-holes are not all the same, but you can tell there's underneath it is some kind of is an understanding of the system, and my feeling has always been that it's not that different from a Cremonese instrument. Like these instruments, do we have what's the next? Do we have a picture of the body? I think it's the one after the. Well, let's talk about. We'll go back. Yeah. So anyway, this is. These are just some images that we kind of used as a reference when we were thinking about designing this new instrument. So there's some things about these instruments. Maybe can I grab the cello for the church bass?
Yeah.
Is it okay if I don't go into the microphone for this? So this instrument has some distinctive things about it that are different from Cremonese violins. One of them is these corners are extremely long, right? And the F-holes are, they're very curvy, and they also take up a lot of real estate, like left to right. And the proportions of this are not that different from a regular Cremonese cello, but the arching is quite a bit different. Like the fact that this comes up so fast from the edge, and it's very flat on the top, and that's not atypical of these instruments. They really start off this way, in a kind of extreme way, get a little more tame over time. The head is like you can tell it's a regular scroll, but it's the concept of it is slightly different from a Cremonese idea because the peg box and the volute are treated as separate elements, And a Cremonese instrument, you really can't tell where one stops and the other part begins. It's goes very naturally. Whereas Prescott says, no, this is the peg box, it's flat, and then it stops, and then the decorative part starts. Two different things. So we kind of just took some of those ideas, just because it looks slightly different from a Cremonese head, in that the volume is bigger than it would be in a Cremonese head, and the peg box is more slender and curves a little bit more like a plant or something. I've never seen it myself, but this kind of shows you the same sort of idea, the peg box versus the volume. The f-holes you can see are kind of rounded. Maybe I should show it around, because I do have to varnish it still.
Yeah, wow.
So they're that kind of rounded, like the.
And bowed string instruments are, they're quite incredible. They're really amazing, and they're all local. It's the history of the area, and it's been incredibly exciting and fun to be able to interact with that history. And I'm so thankful to be able to share a little bit of that with you. So thank you very much.